Welcome back, all you bulls and bears and betas out there, to the buzz of this Proxyopoly spin-off series we call the Proxyopoly Podcast. I'm your host, the Proxyopolist, formerly known as the Jackal of Trades, aka Jesse Colbertic, at your service again today, Proxyopolist, to give you another proprietary Proxyopoly research report generated for none other than the largest asset manager on planet Earth, BlackRock Inc. That's right, Proxyopolist. BlackRock Inc. now has a Proxyopoly score based on the proprietary Proxyopoly research report generated in front of me, which I will read for you now. Let's begin, shall we? The proxy black hole, where corporate governance goes to disappear. Published by Proxyopoly of the Whole and its alternative forms. Dated Proxy Season 2025. In our executive summary of BlackRock Inc., BlackRock has reached a level of systemic governance dominance unseen in modern financial history. As the world's largest asset manager, with over $10 trillion in assets under management, AUM, BlackRock's voting influence now touches nearly every public company on planet Earth. Through its passive and active investment strategies, namely its passive strategies, primarily iShares ETFs, and its institutional index funds, BlackRock has become the arbiter of boardroom composition, executive pay, environmental, social, and governance policies, ESG, and shareholder rights. While positioning itself as a neutral fiduciary, BlackRock has constructed a proxy empire, voting on behalf of millions of investors who have no practical recourse to challenge or redirect that power. This report, written by Proxyopoly of the Whole and its alternative forms, assigns BlackRock a Proxyopoly score of, you gotta wait till the end of the podcast, Proxyopolist, indicating extreme governance centrality and proxy distortion far exceeding that of a traditional asset manager. In this framework, each proxy vote cast by BlackRock at its own AGM is conceptually weighted against the billions of votes it casts on behalf of investors at other companies, creating a gravitational proxy imbalance, or in other words, a governance singularity mathematically. We're now going to dive into the Proxyopoly score by analyzing its underlying Proxyopoly ratings. First, we take a look at Proxyopoly rating number 1, proxy accumulation resistance. Proxyopoly has given BlackRock the PAR of negative 0.35, classifying it as absolutely immune to resistance by proxy. While there is no viable path to aggravating enough shareholder voting power to meaningfully oppose management decisions at BlackRock, the structure of its shares, the composition of its institutional shareholders, and the passive apathy of index investors combine to make BlackRock's AGM the most futile venue for democratic governance in modern finance. Supporting evidence? We got it. BlackRock's top shareholders, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity, aren't those other asset managers? Sure, share similar business models and will not challenge the status quo. So who will? Proxyopoly dares to ask. More supporting evidence? Coming at you. Retail investors in iShares funds have no say in governance and cannot direct their own votes. Not to mention that no major activist campaign has ever succeeded in altering BlackRock's board or corporate policy. Thus, the Proxyopoly accumulation resistance score is negative 0.35. Moving on to Proxyopoly rating number 2, the Bylaw Fortification Index, or BFI. And for what Proxyopoly can only classify as governance fossilization, Proxyopoly has assigned the Proxyopoly rating of the Bylaw Fortification Index a rating of negative 0.25. And describing the rationale for Proxyopoly rating, we will elaborate that BlackRock's bylaws operate as a structural moat, metaphorically. They do not need to weaponize supermajorities or poison pills because shareholder disengagement is structurally baked into their system. Proxy challenges never reach the ballot. Let's look into the SEC's no action relief for that one. Supporting evidence. The company has not meaningfully amended its bylaws to respond to governance trends over the past decade. Shareholder access to nominations is technically permitted, but logistically impossible without billion-dollar margins of scale, impractical to the average investor. Board elections are uncontested and passed by enormous majorities, with turnout dominated by institutional inertia, internally and externally. Thus, we once again at Proxyopoly have issued a Proxyopoly rating, the Bylaw Fortification Index, a rating of negative 0.25. Moving on to Proxyopoly rating number 3, the Shareholder Hostility Quotient, for which Proxyopoly has given a Proxyopoly rating of positive 1.95, and with a shareholder hostility quotient of positive 1.95, Proxyopoly can only classify this as institutionalized disenfranchisement. BlackRock actively lobbies against proposals that would weaken its centralized proxy control. When shareholders attempt to democratize vote directions in its passive funds, BlackRock dismisses such efforts as operationally complex, all while positioning itself as a steward of long-term governance. Supporting evidence, Proxyopoly definitely has it. In 2022 and 2023, BlackRock's management opposed every single shareholder proposal that would have enabled investors in iShare funds to direct their votes. Egregious. BlackRock opposed proposals to separate the roles of CEO and chair on its board. Larry Fink's letter to investors espouses purposeful capitalism, yet the company silences internal attempts to bring that purpose to its own governance. Thus, Proxyopoly has given a Proxyopoly rating in the shareholder hostility quotient of positive 1.95, well above 1 or the mean decided by Proxyopoly TM. Moving on to Proxyopoly rating number 4, Executive Entrenchment Factor, EEF, for which Proxyopoly has given a Proxyopoly rating of positive 1.85. Quite intimidating to say the least. Nonetheless, Proxyopoly classifies this executive entrenchment factor of positive 1.85 as permanent chairmanship via internal and external inertia. Larry Fink has been the CEO of BlackRock since BlackRock's inception in 1988. Fink has faced no formal challenge to his authority, and no shareholder-driven efforts to consider alternative leadership structures have survived the first proxy gatekeeping set in place by BlackRock. Supporting evidence. Fink has also a holding of the chair position, in addition to being BlackRock's CEO, despite near universal investor preferences for a split CEO and chair model. Fink's 2023 compensation package was valued at $32.7 million, including performance bonuses based on discretionary criteria. Board composition remains relatively static, with over 60% of directors serving 8+ years. And we can get into the fact as to whether or not any of those board members are overboarded at other boards. To be continued. Stay tuned, Proxyopolis, for more Proxyopoly scores. On to Proxyopoly rating number 5. Having completed the executive entrenchment factor, we now move on to Proxyopoly rating number 5, the regulatory evasion measure, or REM. Proxyopoly assigns a Proxyopoly rating of 0.64, and that is a positive 0.64. Proxyopoly has assigned this Proxyopoly rating of 0.64, classifying BlackRock as a systemic exemption strategist. Despite being arguably the most systemically important financial entity in the world, BlackRock continues to evade systemically important financial institution designation, avoids stress tests, and self-regulates its ESG activities. ESG standing once again for environmental, social, and governance. BlackRock's lobbying arm ensures regulators remain behind the curve. Supporting evidence for the regulatory evasion measure of positive 0.64, BlackRock has never been classified as a global systemically important financial institution, or GSIFI, despite its assets under management exceeding the GDP of every country except the United States and China. The Securities Exchange Commission and the United States Department of Labor have regulatory proposals on ESG disclosure and fiduciary voting, which have been directly influenced or delayed by BlackRock lobbying. The firm maintains a revolving door with the U.S. Treasury and central banking institutions globally to maintain its systemic exemption strategy from regulatory scrutiny. Thus, once again, BlackRock receives a regulatory evasion measure of 0.64. And this episode and this report are broken down into multiple parts. And we have now concluded part 1 of this report, and I will now pause for everyone to take a bathroom break or do whatever they need to do. Call their lawyer. Do whatever you need to do. It's Proxyopoly, baby. If it ain't Proxyopoly, you're Proxyopolying. And with that pause being said, we're moving on to part 2. Part 2. Structural governance breakdown, performance context, and systemic proxy influence. BlackRock's systemic governance profile can be described as the world's largest shareholder, yet nobody votes. In BlackRock's corporate governance structure, Proxyopoly rather describes it as a fortress of passive control. BlackRock's governance model is deceptively simple at first glance. A board of directors, a unified executive, chair and CEO, in addition to several committees responsible for risk and compensation. But beneath that simplicity lies an ecosystem built to absorb and neutralize dissent. For example, the combined executive chair and CEO model, for which Larry Fink holds both positions of chair and CEO of BlackRock since its inception. While this dual role is increasingly frowned upon by global governance standards, BlackRock continues to justify it through strategic continuity. Shareholder proposals to split the role have never been passed, and the board has consistently advised them to vote against any proposal on the ballot of BlackRock's AGM to split the roles of chair and CEO. Fink's leadership is woven so deeply into the firm's identity that even internal succession planning is viewed as taboo. This is once again an internal and external report. Board tenure and composition. 8 of 12 directors have served longer than 8 years. Once again, 8 of the 12 directors have served longer than 8 years. And the average age of the board is 65. And only 2 of those have recent experience as CEOs of other public companies. Once again, we circle back to overboarding and why it pays to keep listening to the Proxyopoly podcast. No directors on this board have significant governance experience in passive asset management or ETF structures, the core of BlackRock's modern business model. At its annual general meetings, which are conducted with minimal transparency, all board nominees receive 95% plus approval. Shareholder questions are pre-screened and selected by corporate affairs, ensuring no public dissent or challenge reaches the floor or webcast of the annual general meeting. Once again, this annual general meeting should be conducted in person in accordance with Robert's Rule of Order, as I'm sure that any mutatis mutandis of any bylaws would prescribe, but I'm just the Proxyopoly, formerly known as the Jackal of Trades. Shareholder rights section of Part 2. Technically intact, but functionally dormant. BlackRock shareholders, ironically, many of whom are other asset managers, retain the formal right to file proposals and nominate directors, but in practice, no successful shareholder proposal has altered the governance of BlackRock since its IPO. Shareholder proposals on environmental, social, and governance proposals, ESG, again, voting transparency, and fiduciary alignment are routinely blocked or opposed. Universal proxy cards, or other attempts to reform by activist investors, are stonewalled with procedural barriers internally at BlackRock. This is not a firm with weak shareholder rights. It is a firm with a well-oiled machine designed to make those shareholder rights irrelevant. Moving on to the performance context and compensation philosophy section of Part 2. Financial performance, strong, but not unassailable. BlackRock's growth has been stunning, particularly since the global financial crisis. The firm has more than doubled its assets under management since 2012 and commands the largest ETF platform on Earth. Here are some examples. In 2020, asset under management was $8.6 trillion. Net income was $4.93 billion. And earnings per share was 31.85. In 2021, assets under management was over $10 trillion. Net income was over $5.9 billion, and earnings per share, 38.22. In 2022, assets under management was $8.59 trillion. Net income, $5.18 billion. Earnings per share, 33.97. And in 2023, assets under management were $9.430 trillion. Estimated net income, $5.45 billion, and EPS, 36.5. But while financial performance remains strong at BlackRock, it masks governance flaws. Compensation or executive remuneration at BlackRock is not aligned with long-term value creation. Think's bonuses are based on internal board discretion, with few hard metrics related to long-term shareholder value or governance reform. Earnings per share growth has not outpaced the broader S&P 500, but executive pay has far exceeded sector medians. Once again, to revisit the EPS or earnings per share, as previously mentioned, they are all remaining between the 31 to 38 range. BlackRock's iShares ETF platform is increasingly cannibalizing active products, creating internal conflicts of interest that BlackRock's corporate governance structure has failed to monitor. Moving on to the systemic proxy influence section of Part 2, summarized as one vote to rule them all. A single vote at BlackRock's AGM is equivalent to billions elsewhere, thus reminding the Proxyopolist at home of the significance of this report in question, from which I'm reading to you now, and the reason why it is episode number 2 of season 2 of the Proxyopoly podcast. And the theoretical basis for the final Proxyopoly score to be revealed at the end of this podcast based on the underlying Proxyopoly ratings, which I have read to you previously. The theoretical basis for this rests on a fundamental asymmetry. Each proxy vote cast at BlackRock's own shareholder meeting is materially less important than each vote BlackRock casts on behalf of its clients as a fiduciary. This creates a beta-like distortion wherein BlackRock's influence on external governance is orders of magnitude greater than the governance it is subject to internally. BlackRock votes at over 17,000 annual general meetings per year. It controls 5% or more of nearly 98% of S&P 500 companies. And BlackRock's own AGM receives less than 1% of total governance press coverage or scrutiny from shareholders in the press. Case studies to exemplify this are as follows. We've listed here corporate outcomes shaped by BlackRock, as previously mentioned. In 2021, at the AGM of ExxonMobil, the active asset manager, Engine Number 1, successfully placed 3 new directors on Exxon's board. BlackRock casts its votes in favor of the activists, a rare example of its influence actually being decisive. Example number 2, in 2022 to 2024, at the Tesla annual general meetings, despite dozens of proposals to separate CEO and chair roles to rein in executive compensation of an alleged Elon Musk, BlackRock voted against all of them. BlackRock voted against all of them. Not to mention the fact that BlackRock's vote alone swung the outcome of say-on-pay proposals for Tesla, which is how executives are paid. It's called executive remuneration at the 2023 Tesla AGM. Moving on to Meta Platforms AGM in 2023, there was a shareholder proposal on the ballot to evaluate algorithmic bias in content moderation, largely supported by ESG investors, but BlackRock abstained, causing the resolution itself to fail. Once again, these are all examples of where BlackRock holds such a significant influence, where it alone, the company BlackRock, is able to be the deciding factor to determine whether or not proposals on ballots at annual general meetings of companies, 98% of which being on the S&P 500, 17,000 companies, for which BlackRock votes annual general meetings across a calendar year, holding a significant influence on the outcome of those decisions. Once again, worth noting that BlackRock controls 5% or more of nearly 98% of S&P 500 companies. Thus, the scrutiny and criticism you are listening to now. Proxyopoly comes to one conclusion at the end of part 2. When BlackRock votes, it is as if 10 million investors have spoken without ever opening their mouths. And I'll take this opportunity to close my mouth and take a break before part 3 begins. The Proxyopoly score for BlackRock part 3. Recommendations, remedies, and policy interventions. These recommendations are once again suggested measures for improvement at the governance level for BlackRock Inc. And they read as follows. How to dismantle a proxy empire without breaking the market. 1. Strategic imperatives for shareholders. The central paradox of its model is that investors who depend on BlackRock for capital preservation have lost the ability to preserve their governance rights, namely their equity voting rights in the shares that they hold. Restoring shareholder direction of proxy voting and passive funds would allow passive investors a few benefits. Passive investors should not forfeit governance rights by default. The fiduciary delegation model at BlackRock must evolve with the 21st century. Recommendations are as follows. Default opt-out mechanisms. Investors in iShares ETFs should have the ability to direct their own votes unless they explicitly delegate that right to BlackRock instead of that right defaulting to BlackRock automatically. Recommendation number 2. Retail proxy platforms. BlackRock should be required to build and maintain a user-friendly digital platform for retail investors to exercise voting power independent of BlackRock. Recommendation number 3. Fund-by-fund transparency. BlackRock must disclose voting records on a fund-level basis, allowing shareholders to understand how their capital is being used in governance decisions, in addition to the regulatory filings BlackRock already does with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and I am specifically referring to NPX filing with the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. Moving on to the other section of Part 3, recommendations, remedies, and policy interventions. We move on to the subject of splitting the chair and CEO roles immediately. Concentration of power in the hands of a single executive, particularly one with decades of uncontested control, is antithetical to sound governance. Recommendations by Proxyopoly TM are as follows. Amend the bylaws to prohibit combined chair and CEO roles by default, permitting exceptions only with a 2/3 supermajority vote. Recommendation number 2, for splitting the chair and CEO roles, appoint an independent external chair with a background in institutional governance and fund fiduciary law. Recommendation number 3 by Proxyopoly for splitting the chair and CEO roles immediately, establish a mandatory board rotation schedule targeting a 50% refresh by 2027. I think that's fairly reasonable. Moving on to the third subject of the recommendations, remedies, and policy interventions by Proxyopoly TM for BlackRock Inc. is subjecting BlackRock to systemic risk regulation. BlackRock's systemic influence demands systemic responsibility. Recommendations by Proxyopoly TM are as follows. Recommendation 1, reclassify BlackRock as a global systemically important financial institution via FSOC and the Financial Stability Board. Recommendation number 2, subject the firm to annual stress testing, capital adequacy requirements, and proxy stewardship audits by the SEC and the OCC. Require a proxy voting risk disclosure report to be published annually, outlining how BlackRock's aggregate proxy voting decisions affect market stability, shareholder rights, and long-term value of the shareholders for which BlackRock is acting as a fiduciary on behalf of. Not to mention all of the stakeholders of all the companies it invests in, what could very well be a stakeholdership of 8 billion plus people. Moving on to topic number 4 of the recommendations, remedies, and policy interventions section. Create a proxy stewardship fiduciary firewall. BlackRock should not both manage assets and dictate the governance of the companies it invests in. Recommendations by Proxyopoly. Legally mandate a firewall between fund managers and stewardship teams, overseen by an external governance omnibus. Recommendation number 2. Require SEC supervised independent certification of the firm's stewardship policies and proxy voting logic. Recommendation number 3 related to creating a proxy stewardship fiduciary firewall. Prevent portfolio managers from engaging with corporate governance teams on proxy voting issues unless explicitly disclosed in the prospectus of the funds, namely BlackRock's funds, for which the portfolio managers are managing. I'm not here to explain how finance works. I'm just here to explain how the governance structure is, because it's highly likely that's going to happen for every company on the S&P 500 at this point. Or, moreover, any company listed on any global stock exchange. Moving on to the fifth subject of recommendations, remedies, and policy interventions. Establish a market-wide disclosure framework. If BlackRock and other large managers continue to centralize governance, a standardized reporting regime must be implemented internationally. As a reminder, these are only recommendations by Proxyopoly TM. And these are directed at regulators, actually. The Securities Exchange Commission, BaFin, and others should require quarterly disclosure of each large manager's aggregate proxy vote impact score based on company ownership, sectoral concentration, and pass-through governance power. There's a reference to pass-through voting, which is becoming more trending in asset management, but Proxyopoly TM can discuss that later. Recommendation number 2 for establishing a market-wide disclosure framework. Companies whose largest shareholder is a passive manager must publish an influence attribution statement in their proxy filings, describing how much of their governance is indirectly controlled by the index funds that hold them. Recommendation number 3 for establishing a market-wide disclosure framework. Require BlackRock specifically to participate in an annual stress scenario simulation, publicly modeling how a sudden change in its proxy voting policy and guidelines would impact corporate control across the entirety of the S&P 500. That should apply internationally as well for all the other international companies that BlackRock may hold as a asset manager. And within the recommendations, remedies, and policy intervention section, there is a subsection for cultural and philosophical reorientation, and for which, within the cultural and philosophical reorientation section of the recommendations, remedies, and policy interventions, Proxyopoly will speak to the subject of ending governance by algorithm. At its current scale, BlackRock has shifted from an intentional stewardship philosophy to default governance automation. Remedies for this are as follows. Prohibit automation for resolutions related to executive compensation, mergers and acquisitions, as well as board composition. Another recommendation for disclosure framework: implement manual override protocols requiring human governance analysis for any proxy vote at companies where BlackRock owns 3% or more of equity shares, and that would be a lot of those. Remedy suggestion number 3 for ending governance by algorithm at BlackRock: establish a shareholder representation council composed of academics, retirees, and retail investors to advise on passive fund governance priorities in the 21st century. And these again are suggested remedies to the benefit of BlackRock and its stakeholders. Cultural and philosophical reorientation suggestion number 2. Reinvent democratic ownership at BlackRock. And here is why democratic ownership should be reinvented at BlackRock. Ownership should not entail only financial exposure, but also governance accountability. Suggestions for long-term reform by Proxyopoly regarding reinvesting democratic ownership within BlackRock are as follows. Launch shareholder co-ops that enable retail ETF holders to consolidate their governance power outside of BlackRock's discretionary stewardship. Suggestion number 2 for long-term reform of BlackRock's democratic ownership is incentivizing third-party proxy intermediaries that allow index investors to delegate their voting to entities aligned with their personal or political values, labor rights, climate, or executive pay fairness. Suggestion number 3 for long-term reform: to reinvest in democratic ownership at BlackRock. Offer passive funds with silent shares, where BlackRock abstains from voting and passes votes back to the investors directly. Moving on to the final section of the recommendations, remedies, and policy interventions suggested by Proxyopoly TM are related to global coalition building at the stewardship level for proxy voting. Coordinating cross-jurisdictional regulation, as BlackRock's governance influence spans all continents. Reform cannot occur in silos. Key coalitions to engage internationally. European Securities and Markets Authority, ESMA, encourage creation of EU-wide fund governance reforms targeting large passive asset managers like BlackRock. Another key coalition to engage Japan Financial Services Agency, push for local investors to demand voting rights in funds advised by foreign managers. And forward is the USA for a Japanese investor. It's an international game, Proxyopoly. Another key coalition to engage, Canadian securities administrators. These jurisdictional regulations should develop stewardship responsibility guidelines harmonized with international standards. And these are all, again, suggestions by Proxyopoly to draw your attention to the mismanagement and misadventures at the governance level of large asset managers. Moving on to the second topic of global coalition building, challenge governance capture in the U.S. political system. BlackRock's lobbying efforts and revolving door relationships with regulators prevent reform from gaining any meaningful traction. Proxyopoly lists urgent steps to challenge governance capture in the U.S. political system by BlackRock. And urgent step number one, as a suggested measure, implement a 3-year cooling off period for former BlackRock executives seeking appointments at Treasury, Federal Reserve, or other regulatory bodies. Urgent step number 3, require congressional disclosure of meetings with BlackRock lobbyists under an expanded Lobbying Disclosure Act. Urgent step number 3, pass legislation requiring the Securities and Exchange Commission to publicly disclose any rulemaking language drafted in collaboration with large asset managers like BlackRock. And we're reaching the final summary and call to action within part 3 of this extended Proxyopoly research report on the subject of the Proxyopoly score for BlackRock. And Proxyopoly's final summary and call to action to the benefit of BlackRock's corporate governance on behalf of all of its shareholders and its fiduciary clients are as follows. BlackRock has crossed the threshold from fiduciary to sovereign actor in corporate governance. Its structures, size, and philosophy have created a proxyopoly wherein its internal votes are irrelevant. Its external votes shape the entire financial system as we know it, my fellow Proxyopolists. The recommendations offered here by Proxyopoly TM, a registered trademark containing intellectual property protected under the trademark of Proxyopoly by the United States Patent and Trademark Office, offer recommendations here from restructuring its board to democratize ETF voting rights, representing not only a roadmap to restoring governance balance, but a reassertion of what ownership in capital markets is supposed to mean in a free, democratic financial system. If left unchecked, BlackRock will continue to determine who sits on boards, what executives earn, and how capital is allocated without the consent or even awareness of those BlackRock represents. My fellow Proxyopolists, I am speaking to you now, Jesse Cole Burdick, to the Proxyopolist at home. It is not too late to reform the Proxyopoly of BlackRock, but the hour is late. It is actually getting late here. It's probably about 9:30 on the eve of April 3rd. And before this podcast wraps up, I almost neglected to disclose the final Proxyopoly score for BlackRock. Aren't you glad you listened to the whole episode? Before we disclose the final Proxyopoly score, let's give a rundown of the 5 Proxyopoly ratings for which are underlying the Proxyopoly score, which overlays the underlying Proxyopoly ratings. I hope everyone sees what I'm getting at here, because you are listening to it. But if you want to actually see it, the report is available on Patreon, which can be found on the link tree, which is linktree/nascarcosa. At any rate, this is the rundown and summary for the Proxyopoly ratings of BlackRock. I skipped over everything that I just said and just wanted to hear the final Proxyopoly score. For Proxyopoly rating number 1, the Proxy Accumulation Resistance, or PAR, Proxyopoly has given a Proxyopoly rating of negative 0.35. For Proxyopoly rating number 2, Bylaw Fortification Index, or BFI, Proxyopoly has designated a Proxyopoly rating of negative 0.25. For Proxyopoly rating number 3, Shareholder Hostility Quotient, Proxyopoly has designated a Proxyopoly rating of positive 1.95. For Proxyopoly rating number 4, Executive Entrenchment Factor, EEF, Proxyopoly has designated a Proxyopoly rating of positive 1.85. And the 5th Proxyopoly rating, Regulatory Evasion Measure, REM, Proxyopoly has designated a Proxyopoly rating of positive 0.64. Thus, we are drawing to the conclusion of the episode and the announcement of the final Proxyopoly score for BlackRock, which is positive 1.42. Not a good look for you, Proxyopolis. The Proxyopoly score and accompanying analysis are purely hypothetical and for entertainment and educational purposes only. Any resemblance to real-world events is purely coincidental, though with this company's governance trajectory, reality may be catching up faster than we expect, bearing in mind that past performance is not indicative of future returns. My name is Jesse Colbertic, a.k.a. the Jackal of Trades. On behalf of Proxyopoly of the whole and its alternative forms, signing off with this strictly confidential research report for your educational and entertainment purposes. Stay tuned, Proxyopolis. And don't forget to participate in the next poll. You take part in creating the system, Proxyopolis. If it ain't Proxyopoly, you're Proxyopolying.